KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Daniel Cozart, Assistant Professor of History at Hood College and author of the book Afro-Peruvian Mestizos, The Invisibility of Blackness in Post-Abolition Peru. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Daniel Cozart.
Thank you very much for having me, Dr. Horne.
So why did you produce this book?
So as a graduate student, first in my master's program in Latin American Studies at UNC Charlotte, I read a really fascinating book by an ethnomusicologist, Heidi Carolyn Feldman, called Black Rhythms of Peru. And that was one of the first books I read that introduced me to Afro-Peruvian history and Afro-Peruvians as a category of historical analysis. She explains in that book that in the 1950s, in really great detail, it's a fascinating book, how there was this rediscovery of Afro-Peruvian identity and culture that has progressed through the late 20th century into the present day and continues to build. But I was really curious about this population, and in that book, she also includes a statistic that the 1940 census, the last to include racial labels in the 20th century, reported that less than 0.5% of the nation's population was identified as Black or Afro-Peruvian, despite the fact that in the 16th and early 17th centuries, a majority of the coastal population of colonial Peru was identified as African descended or African. So I was really curious about this perceived disappearance and invisibility that I came to then encounter as a doctoral student researching the archives of Peru as well. I wanted to square this apparent erasure of history. So I dove into census records and a wide variety of other primary source materials to try to find a more complete answer to this question.
So why was there a systematic exclusion of Afro-Peruvians from Peruvian history?
I think the best answer to that question as to why is rooted in what we can see throughout the history of the Americas, which is a dominant ideology of white supremacy, and simply put, racism and anti-Blackness. We see that come through in the secondary literature that I analyzed throughout the book, including works in the early 20th century that I argue resemble earlier 19th century works in other parts of the Caribbean in particular, on abolitionist movements that both romanticized the history of African-descended peoples in the Americas, but also placed them in a colonial past and assumed that they had no place in the modern nation state or in the modern state countries moving forward.
So slavery was abolished in Peru in 1855. Prior to that date, was there any history of resistance, anything from malingering to open revolt to collaboration with foreign powers?
Yes. First, in the colonial era, there was a massive slave rebellion under the leadership of an enslaved Afro-Peruvian named Francisco Congo. And there's actually an activist movement named after him that was established in the 1950s and continued through the 1980s that then transitioned into bigger activist movements that remain in place, including the CEDET, or Centro de Desarrollo Étnico, in Lundu, another Afro-Peruvian activist organization. Beyond that, I found in the archives, kind of deeply buried in some of the records from a leftist magazine publication, an account of a pan-Latin American movement that was associated with the Anti-Imperialist League in the 1920s, in which I found a really explicit call for a Black movement against U.S. imperialism as well. So there were movements both before and after this, after the abolition of slavery. I should also add that abolition was achieved mainly through the efforts of Afro-Peruvians who were enslaved themselves. There's a great deal of work on this by one of my dissertation advisors, Dr. Carlos Aguirre at the University of Oregon. So I would highly recommend his work, Agentes de su propia libertad, which translates to agents of their own liberation.
Now, you mentioned Francisco Congo, and that suggests to me that the Congo was a site from which Africans were shipped as enslaved commodities to Peru. Is that accurate? And if so, what other parts of Africa do the enslaved emerge from?
Yes, that is accurate. That is one of the sites of origin of enslaved people forced across the Atlantic to Peru. But there were a wide array of cultural origins of enslaved Africans who were forced to the west coast of South America, including Lukumi, Yoruba, but even as far away as Madagascar. That was my most perhaps surprising finding in reading secondary literature about the history of slavery in Peru was when doing research in northern Peru in particular, I found a book called Mangacheria Rabiosa. And I did some research into the origins of that term mangacheria because I'd never heard anything like that before. And it turns out it's a reference to people from Madagascar who are kind of popularly called mangaches on the northern coast of Peru.
Are there any parallels with Argentine history in terms of the systematic exclusion of people of African descent from Peruvian history? And not only parallels, were there influences from Argentina in terms of this systematic exclusion?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that I came across in studying and researching census records of the early 20th century was a 1908 census of the city of Lima. And that census appears to have been modeled directly after the national censuses of Argentina that shortly preceded it. And what was significant about that was that it reduced the number of categories indicating African ancestry, which seemed to me to be intentional. It's a way that I argue of officials and elite people in positions of power using their power to construct a top-down narrative of whitening that denied the existence of African-descended people in their own country, essentially following the model of Argentina, that it had a great deal of success in so-called whitening, in their view, right, by importing millions of Europeans over the course of the early 20th century to whiten the population. Peru didn't have as much success, so to speak, in recruiting European immigrants, but they took a different route, which was through manipulating the archives and the sources themselves.
So we know that Argentina, for example, sought to attract migrants from Italy to their country. What were the sources of the Europeans who were coming to Peru during this time?
What I've seen, there was a general emphasis on attracting immigrants from Spain, but one of the leading figures I analyze, whose work I analyze in this book, is Clemente Palma. He was the son of one of the most well-known and renowned Afro-Peruvian intellectuals in the history of the country, Ricardo Palma. And Clemente rejected his own family's African ancestry outright and actually argued in a doctoral thesis called El Porvenir de las Razas del Perú, or the Future of the Peruvian Races, that the country should make a concerted effort to recruit German immigrants to improve the population in that way. But as far as I know, there was not much success in these endeavors.
So I've been made to understand that there is a continuing tradition in Peru of hiring Afro-Peruvian pallbearers for funerals. And after reading about that, it left me befuddled because I could not understand what was undergirding that tradition. Do you have any insight there?
Yes, absolutely. This is a long-held tradition dating back to the colonial era, in which enslaved Afro-Peruvians would be used, especially as pallbearers for people who were considered elite status. And that tradition of kind of enforcing a racial hierarchy in a really public way persists in the present day. I think there was an article in the New York Times about 10 or 15 years ago addressing this particular issue that said outright, Peru is a racist country. And I thought it was a really interesting take and a good piece of evidence to support that argument, absolutely.
So is there an underlying assumption that if you have an Afro-Peruvian pallbearer, that'll provide a ticket to heaven, for example?
I haven't seen it expressed quite that explicitly, but it does seem to promote a sense of the high status of the deceased person. That it's interesting how that dynamic persists into the 21st century, of using people of color in Peru to assert one's own family elite status.
Mm. Finally, Daniel Cozart, author of the book Afro-Peruvian Mestizos, given the racism and white supremacy that they faced, has there been substantial outmigration of Afro-Peruvians? And if so, to where?
Unfortunately, I have not come across much evidence of that. In working with activist organizations and researching along the northern coast of Peru from Lima as far north as Piura, what I've encountered is a demand that Afro-Peruvians be seen, and that their hard-earned place in the nation state of Peru be recognized. And that means recognizing both their history and their contributions to the country in their local settings. So this has spurred the development of Afro-Peruvian museums from Lima through Piura. And these museums really showcase Afro-Peruvian contributions at the local level to assert their well-earned place in the country. So despite the obstacles and persistent challenges that this population has faced over centuries, from what I've seen, for the most part, most of this population wants to remain